The Valentine, also known as the Infantry Tank Mark III, was the most produced British tank of the Second World War, accounting for almost a quarter of all British tank production during the war. Yet despite this, I often find that it is overlooked when compared to other British tanks, such as the Matilda, Crusader and Cromwell. I will have a look at it now and see whether it deserves to get more attention than it gets. The Valentine started life as a private venture by Vickers in an attempt to up-armour their existing Cruiser II tank. The new design had up to 60mm of armour and, in using parts from the previous cruisers, was easy to produce and reliable. The Matilda II, then in production, was costly and difficult to produce, making the Valentine seem like a good replacement. The Valentine Mark I featured a crew of 3, a driver, gunner and commander. It was armed with a 2-pounder gun, the most common British anti-tank gun of the early war. It was very effective for only being 40mm in diameter, especially when compared to the equivalent guns of other nations in the 37 to 45mm range. But it did lack a high explosive shell, making it less effective against hard targets. The 2-man turret was also considered an issue, but as war was looming, it was ordered into production anyway. The first vehicles underwent trials in May of 1940, and by the end of that year, it was being used as a cruiser tank. Probably its most famous use in British service was in North Africa with the 8th Army. First going into action in late 1941, it performed well and began to replace the expensive Matilda. Around this time, it also began to be used in the cruiser tank role, partly due to the lack of cruisers and also due to the fact that it was both faster and better armoured than the Cruiser II. It was also used heavily by the Soviets, with over 3,000 of the 8,000 being built sent to the USSR as a part of the Aid to Russia Fund. Whilst much smaller and lacking firepower when compared to the other Soviet tanks such as the T-34 and the Sherman, it was very well liked by the troops, with its small size and reliability lending itself well to combat on the Eastern Front. So overall, it seems like a fairly good tank, performing well despite some flaws which the vast majority of armoured vehicles face anyway at some point in their lifetimes. The main issue was the firepower. Initially only being equipped with a 2-pounder gun in a 2-man turret, the Marks III and V introduced a 3-man turret, which increased the performance of the turret crew by adding a dedicated loader. He took a lot of strain off the commander, who was previously forced to act as the loader on top of his other duties. In addition to this, the Mark IX was equipped with a 6-pounder gun, which was one of the best anti-tank guns of the war, in my opinion, and a vast increase to its firepower. The later Mark XI was fitted with the QF 75mm to give it an effective high explosive round, but this was produced in small quantities and only ever used as a commander tank, as the chassis was obsolete by the time of its introduction. The main reason I think the Valentine is underrated is due to its size. It's very small, the gun isn't very scary, it doesn't look threatening, in fact I think it's rather cute to look at, but overall it's very easy to skip over in a museum. When placed next to the bigger, scarier tanks of the late war, it doesn't look like much, and even the name doesn't sound particularly intimidating, with the dulcet sounds of Valentine being in stark contrast to the completely dehumanised T-34 or fear-inducing Tiger. What they don't realise, however, is the massive contribution it made to the Allied war effort. Before the arrival of American tanks such as the M3, the Valentine was the only reasonably effective tank that could be produced cheaply and quickly, especially after the little incident at Dunkirk where our tank force's size decreased considerably. Its presence on the Eastern Front is all but forgotten in history, partly due to Joseph Stalin hiding the true scale of Allied help to make it seem like it was entirely a Soviet effort, but also due to the fact that the Valentines did actually make up a rather small amount of Soviet tanks during the war. When I look at how good a tank is, I always like to focus on comparing what it was designed for to how well it did what it was designed for. Compared to other tanks and vehicles that perform similar roles, the Valentine was designed as an infantry tank as a replacement for the Matilda, as I mentioned before. In its role as an infantry tank, it performed adequately in terms of armour and speed, but as the gun lacked a high explosive shell, it couldn't completely fill the role required as a true infantry support weapon, especially when compared to something like the Panzer IV with a 75mm howitzer. It was also used as a cruiser tank later on, due to its increase in both armour protection and speed over the Cruiser II. The hull was used for a variety of other vehicles as well, with varying degrees of success, such as the Bishop and Archer. So overall, I would say the Valentine gets probably a 6 out of 10 when used in its designated role as an infantry tank, but it scores even higher due to its ability to be used in a variety of situations. Still though, the name isn't really well known, which I believe should change. The Valentine contributed just as much, if not more, to the war effort when compared to other British tanks like the Cromwell or Churchill. It stood strong in the dark times early in the war, and it came out fighting on the other side. I hope you've enjoyed hearing my opinions on the Valentine. If you enjoyed, then comment what you think about it, or if there are other tanks you want to discuss, leave a comment about them as well. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.